It's Wellness Wednesdays. It's Wellness Wednesdays. And you see, I'm kind of slumped in my seat. I'm tired. But today we are talking about empathy. Will I manage another upload? Specifically, what gets in the way of empathy? Too long didn't read or too long didn't listen. It ain't social media. I see the exact same behaviors off social media that I see on social media in terms of the things that get in the way of us having empathy for each other. And it may not be what you think, but if you like this sort of content, help support this channel. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com/Leanna K, or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone who can use it and can't afford it. Coffee.com/Leanna K. If you're thinking about signing up for a Leanna Care session, it's a good time right now because people are taking summer vacations, so there are some openings that previously it was pretty booked up for the last few weeks, which is why I haven't been talking about it much. So empathy. Yeah, I think we can all agree that there is a real deficit of effective functional empathy for other people out there. And it's really easy to blame social media, but I don't think social media is doing it. I started noticing this lack of empathy before the rise of social media. It the first time I noticed it was in, graduates of a specific era of business schools that were coming out trained in a particular form of business ethics that, were all about shareholders and not about workers, and, them being encouraged to not care about the people working for them, only the people profiting from them. And this was a big wake-up call to me that a lack of empathy actually can be taught. Certain ethical frameworks do downplay empathy, understanding other people's state of mind, because, more deontological approaches insist that every action is inherently good or inherently bad. There's no gray area, easy peasy, let's break for lunch, right? Like, life's not like that. But if you subscribe to those schools, if you subscribe to the school that the only thing that matters in business is maximizing profits, not treating your employees well, not long-term longevity, just that quarter to quarter, make as much money as you possibly can, well, you're going to do some things that, aren't great for a lot of people chasing the almighty buck. And the thing about empathy is it actually allows you to make better decisions. If you are really good at understanding what's going on with other people, you have wisdom instead of just intelligence, and you end up making better choices and you end up being right more often. That's my pitch for why we should practice better, more effective empathy. And, when I do the It's Not Therapy shows, again, podcast link in the description box, one of my top 10 phrases is listen twice before you talk once. And that's my mantra for difficult discussions or charged discussions. Obviously, you can't pay rapt attention to every single thing somebody says. But when it is tense, or when it is especially important, or you're going to have to make a decision, when I have to make a decision, I am a really big fan of going into listening mode. And listening mode is engaging the empathy, because we have to remind ourselves that the average person is no better than chance at accurately determining whether someone's telling us the truth or not. That's another thing I tell myself all the time. humans are actually not very good lie detectors. And why does this matter? Well, questioning your assumptions is good for accurate decision making, right? Questioning your assumptions also makes you better at empathy. Because the two big barriers to empathy that I have seen are, one, mind reading. People mind read so much. Oh, they said this, but they actually meant that. Okay, how do you know that? Mind reading, right? Unless you're Charles Xavier or Jean Grey, probably not the best move. And even then, you know, but then the other thing I find is a real impediment to empathy is people adding and subtracting from a statement based on either what they're afraid of or what they're anticipated, what they're anticipating instead of actually what they've heard. And little things can change a meaning. I mean, one of the things I've learned that when I'm giving clients affirmations, something like "it wasn't your fault," for instance, somebody who's deeply traumatized just hears "your fault." It wasn't gets dropped because that is a sensitivity. If somebody is in a deep state of self-blame, which is expected with trauma, right? All they're going to hear is the words "your fault." So I try to use things like "you deserve better than this," because there is no way someone can chop off part of that. Now they can add by going, "no, I don't," but that takes more. That takes an act of resistance to the idea as opposed to just mishearing it because you feel so lousy. And that's another thing people do. It's a subset of mind reading, but it's a social comparisons thing, upwards or downwards. For some reason, too many people assume that everybody else has things totally together and they're the only one that's a disaster. And in my experience, that's not true. Everybody is some level of disaster. Everybody is covering up something that they're either not happy about in their life or they haven't quite got figured out. And it's really important to factor that in because it changes your read on what somebody's saying. And the only way to really and truly hear someone accurately and therefore really engage with your empathy is to block out all those assumptions, set aside the baggage you bring into a conversation, stop that adding and subtracting from the statement, stop that attempt at mind reading, stop the assumptions, stop the leaps of logic. You can't listen if you're editing in your head, right? And it's really important to make sure you understand where the other person's coming from, because no one is a perfect communicator, right? So it's really important to understand where the other person is coming from before you respond. And I mean, there are ways of doing that. They call the technique active listening. But it's basically, if I understand where you're coming from, and you paraphrase it to the best of your ability, and then, ask them, did I get that right? Or is there anything I got wrong there? And give the other person an opportunity to clarify the things you may have misunderstood. Because otherwise what happens is every exchange adds to the misunderstanding, right? If you treat every round of a conversation like a round of D&D or Vampire the Masquerade or something like that, right? And you both have hit dice in the conversation, and every misunderstanding takes away HP, right? eventually one or the other person is going to get knocked down and be unable to continue the conversation in a productive way. And the way you prevent that proverbial communication damage, those misunderstandings, is to basically roll a saving throw against misunderstandings by checking things out before you proceed. And another part of what's called active listening is putting yourself in the other person's place. And this is where the empathy comes in. You know, this is another really important part that people skip. They assume something, they don't check it out, and they weigh the rest of the conversation based on a false assumption. So, you know, if somebody tells me something, I'd be, wow, in your situation, I'd be probably pretty pissed off. That gives the other person an opportunity to go, yeah, I am, or I'm not so much pissed off as I am sad, or it's depressing, or something like that. Okay, now you know how the person's feeling. And obviously, a pissed off person and a depressed person are coming at a situation very differently, and that matters, right? I hope it's evident why it matters. It seems like a lot of people, for whatever reason, think that distinction doesn't matter. Think that they can just tell another person what their experience is. Tell the other person what their feelings are, or worse, what their feelings should be about a given thing. And that started off as a tactic for political sparring that unfortunately has become so widespread that I've watched it trickle down into everyday communication between people, and then they don't understand why fights happen and things break down and, you know, that are avoidable. And people in general seem to be getting their communication styles from various forms of either television or YouTube or movies or something. And life doesn't work the way it does in these scripted things. I mean, first of all, keep in mind a lot of the content in, big budget media. There was a narcissist in some part of that development process, and so stuff that works in that fictional world isn't nearly as charming or clear in the real world. But also, I mean, in a lot of those shows, the drama's the point, right? So the exchanges are done to maximize the blast zone socially, not minimize it. And everybody's gonna have things that catch them off guard, push a button, make them see red, or make them feel vulnerable. And that's another thing people don't realize. They're hyper aware of their own vulnerabilities, but they don't realize that other people, everybody has vulnerabilities. Some people hide it better than others, but everybody has things they're sensitive about. And I have never understood this internet thing where people think it's the best thing to do long term to not admit when something bothers them, or not go, I don't like that. The argument is, well, if you don't let it get to you, they'll stop doing it. And I have not found that to be true. I have found that if somebody puts up with abuse, with appearance-based attacks, with people making mean jokes about them. People just keep making the mean comments because they see no harm in it. It doesn't seem to bother them. It becomes part of this brand, her, you know, and it goes on for months and months and months and months. And whenever someone finally does say, hey, maybe that's not the nicest thing. Like, would you like it if somebody said that to you? Well, it doesn't bother them. Are you sure? Have you ever checked? Probably not. And I mean, how many YouTubers, just take YouTubers for now, neglect their health, have serious mental health crises, you know, do things, you know, instant gratification moves that end up being really stupid ideas in the long run. How many people, and that's not even including the tragedies, you know, the number of very, very young Instagram, TikTok, you know, YouTube personalities who end up, you know, dying far too young. How many of those have to happen before we recognize that people are putting on a brave face, but doing this is tougher than most people like to admit? And that's why, one, I admit it when I don't like something, because that gives people a chance, right? I would want to know if something bothers someone, you know? For instance, the whole Latinx thing. My Latin American viewers or people of Latin American descent hate that term. So I don't use it, except when I'm talking about why I don't use it. If there wasn't the dialogue, then I couldn't have that sensitivity, right? Because I think a lot of people who use that term don't mean anything by it. They think it's the right term. They have no idea that most Hispanic people don't like it for various reasons. One, it's a desecration of the construction of Spanish. You don't put X's on the end of words. But that's something that can only come about through dialogue. And if other people want to use that term, that's fine. But people here don't like it. So I don't refer to people that way. Especially if it's an individual and you know what their gender identity is. That drives me crazy. But that's just a technical, that's a you are not thinking thing. That's not on the subject of empathy. And I do really think that conversation, because of the way it's structured in media and academics, and especially academics, everything is a series of right or wrong answers. And people are they come up in this idea of grades and the idea of 100% being even possible. And so instead of learning how to make mistakes and recover from them, which is not something our current academic system rewards, our current academic system rewards not making mistakes in the first place. But the paradigm of knowing how to recover from mistakes is one of empathy, right? You have to recognize when someone has had a bad reaction to something and take the time and clean it up, as opposed to a paradigm of never make any mistakes in the first place. The minute you realize you've made a mistake, it's overwhelming, you freak out, you run away, the whole thing just goes to hell, right? Those are very, very different mindsets. And the world has really leaned into the no mistakes. And I see more and more people these days going, when are we going to honor apologies? When are we going to recognize there is a difference between somebody who admits error and tries to do better and someone who just denies everything and will never be accountable for what they do? When are we going to start rewarding accountability in a person who is willing to admit they made a mistake? But people are actually going to have to start doing that. And eventually we'll get a critical mass of people doing it, and so individual people won't be pilloried for it. The most productive response to mistakes is not always punishment. And more often than not, I think people don't learn anything from punishments nowadays because society is so merciless and the punishments are so harsh that everybody's just in a brace position waiting for it to happen. So when it does happen, it doesn't teach them anything. I think that empathy, even when there is a consequence, and I see consequences as different from punishment, right? Punishment is, we're going to take something away from you actively. This is your punishment. Whereas consequences, well, that person's really upset with you right now. And, if you want to stay their friend, you're going to have to, you're going to have to do something about that. And the problem is, because we're in a culture where mistakes are punished and people don't learn how to make them, that connection, that empathy doesn't happen. Empathy can't happen when you're just terrified of making a mistake or being found out to have made a mistake. When people are trying to appear perfect, they lash out, they pick stupid fights, they don't back down. They don't consider where the other person is coming from because they're so focused on that facade. And that makes it very, very, very difficult to really hear what someone is saying to you. And you can't actually practice empathy unless you hear what someone is saying to you, right? You don't know what you're empathizing with. You don't know what you're responding to if you haven't actually received the message the other person communicated. And so often it gets into this game of, well, you weren't clear. Well, you weren't clear. Well, you didn't say, you weren't clear. You weren't clear. And then the other person is like, I was completely clear. It's just like, okay, communication broke down. It's no one's fault. What's crystal clear to one person will be clear as mud to another person. There are different styles of communication. Nothing lands on everyone. And the problem is we have this sort of political analysis class and a ancillary media. So, entertainment reporting, video game reporting, film reporting, movie reporting. That's all about reading the tea leaves, right? They clearly meant this by that, or look at their body language when they said that. But body language analysis is not an exact science. Any of those things, you look for changes in a person's body language more than, touching your hair means you're lying. No, it means you're nervous. And a lot of people do get nervous when they're not telling the truth. But narcissists and sociopaths don't. So, if you've got someone who's just a pathological liar, they're not going to show those tells because they lie all the time. And there's an example of, you can have empathy for someone who is a pathological liar while acknowledging that they are a pathological liar, and that's not okay. And sometimes you can learn to read the truth behind the lies, figure out what actually went on by understanding the motivations for somebody's lies. Everybody, no one tells the truth 100% of the time, whether to spare someone's feelings or because they don't want to get into it or because they're embarrassed about something. Lies are not always nefarious. And that's another really important part of empathy. If you want to get the truth out of a situation, you have to be aware when people are showing signs of discomfort. Because somebody being nervous doesn't necessarily mean they have ill intent. Somebody being nervous could be because it's not that they don't want to talk about something, they can't talk about something. And if we get on that punitive framework again, you may be punishing, somebody who's going through some bad stuff and it's not their fault. They can't talk about something. They're being coerced. And that happens a lot in entertainment media. It's kind of shocking to me, the things that people believe about mass media and media development, and how much power various producers and things like that have. The vast majority of projects barely get made. It's so difficult with scheduling and locations and all that stuff. It's hard. It's hard. And when these blow-ups happen in entertainment, I usually feel awful for the creators, because somebody goes out there and takes it on the chin, and it's never the network, right? Never. It's always a single individual because they have a face. There's somebody that can be blamed. And nothing ever gets any better because those sacrificial lambs just get replaced by another sacrificial lamb after they're sacrificed. And I think it is very important to remember that even if you don't like someone, that person on the other end of the screen is a human being. And that doesn't mean you're not allowed to disagree. That doesn't mean you're not allowed to criticize. Just make sure it's fair. Even when you're jousting, there are fair comments and there are unfair comments. And most of us have a pretty decent sense of where the line is. Now, I say most of us because people who are, neurodivergent, I feel bad for some neurodivergent people, especially on the autism spectrum. I see some people engaging in certain behaviors, and I don't think they're aware of how they're coming across, because they saw that on a message board somewhere and thought it was funny, and so they repeat it and they get in trouble, and they didn't intend to do anything wrong. And so many people are so first and foremost on the internet afraid of being fooled that they don't practice empathy, and they end up beating up on, some poor kid somebody in their 20s who is, on the autism spectrum, and, oh, you're a troll. No, they're neurodivergent. They're not reading the room, because reading the room is the real struggle for them, right? And it's so funny how many people on the left just are so completely ableist to neurodivergent people, and just demand this standard of conduct that is impossible for people with those challenges. And that's another thing about empathy that's really important, is that a big component of empathy is recognizing that other people do not think the same way we do. They do not come from the same places. They don't make the same assumptions. So you can't assume that somebody's going to interpret something exactly the way you did. That's not empathy. That's a solipsism. You have to read the cues you're getting from the other person and determine their state of mind based on that and connect to that, not act like you're talking to a mirror. And that, I think, is the most misunderstood thing about empathy. So if you want to get better at empathy, if you care about empathy, listen and observe and try to pick things up. Listen twice before you talk once. Try to pick things up before you respond, because that's what you would want, right? In real terms. All right, this has been Wellness Wednesday. Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com/Leanna K, or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone who can use it, can't afford it, coffee.com/Leanna K. Thanks for watching and be well.